Margaret had watched Emily closely since the beginning of her relationship with her son. At first, she thought her concerns were just the natural jealousy of a protective mother. Emily was young, beautiful, and charming. Everyone around seemed to like her, especially David, who was completely smitten. But there was something strange, something that Margaret couldn't ignore. Alone, when David was away, Emily showed a different side. That smile she always flashed in front of others disappeared, giving way to a cold, distant look. Margaret, who had lived long enough to understand people, began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. But how could she tell her son without sounding paranoid? One afternoon while David was at work, Margaret was sitting in the living room reading a book when she heard Emily's footsteps entering the kitchen. The way she closed the door was abrupt, as if she was annoyed. Curious, Margaret approached to greet her. "Emily, darling, are you all right?" Margaret asked, her voice soft and caring. Emily turned slowly, and that polite smile she always showed in David's presence was absent. Her gaze was direct, almost dismissive. "I'm perfectly fine, Margaret," Emily replied, making no effort to hide the dryness in her voice. Margaret swallowed but tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just a bad day. She knew she couldn't judge someone just for a moment of irritation, but from then on, the interaction between them began to become more tense. Emily seemed impatient, as if every word Margaret said was a nuisance. Days passed, and Emily's behavior when she was alone with Margaret only got worse. It was as if the young woman no longer needed to keep up appearances. When David wasn't around, she treated Margaret with indifference, even contempt. Margaret, for her part, tried to avoid conflict, even though she sensed that something was terribly wrong. One evening, after a family dinner, David was in his room sorting out some work emails. Margaret took the opportunity to try to talk to him, in the hope that her son would realize what was going on. "David, I need to talk to you," Margaret began in a worried voice. David, sitting in front of the computer, looked over his shoulder at his mother. "Sure, Mom, what's wrong?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, fearing his reaction. She knew how happy David was with Emily, and she didn't want to destroy that happiness. But the restlessness in her heart was too strong to ignore. "I don't know how to say this, but I've been observing some things about Emily, and I'm worried." David frowned, clearly uncomfortable with what was to come. "What do you mean, Mom?" She took a deep breath, trying to choose her words carefully. "When you're together, she seems perfect, so kind. But when we're alone, she changes. She's cold, sometimes even rude. I know it might sound like something I'm thinking, but I feel there's something strange." David let out a sigh, shaking his head. "Mom, you're imagining things. Emily is under a lot of stress because of the wedding. You know how that can mess with a person's head. She's not like that. You must be misinterpreting her actions." Margaret, even with her son's words, couldn't ignore what her instincts were telling her. But she knew that insisting would only create a barrier between them. So she nodded, although her heart remained heavy. "Maybe you're right, son. Maybe it's just in my head," replied Margaret, wanting to believe that she was wrong. David smiled, looking relieved to be done with it, and turned his attention back to the computer. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was about to happen. Alone in her room that night, Margaret reflected on everything. She knew that David was blinded by love, unable to see what was hidden behind Emily's facade. Her sense of wariness grew with each passing day, and her future daughter-in-law's strange behavior only increased her suspicions. Margaret tried to convince herself that it was just anxiety about the wedding, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that. Something didn't fit. Something dark and cruel lurked beneath Emily's behavior, and Margaret feared what it meant for her son. She still didn't have all the answers, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to ignore her instincts. Not now. She just needed to find out the truth before it was too late. Margaret was still trying to deal with her growing distrust of Emily when something unexpected happened. It was an ordinary evening. David was out working on a project late at night, and Emily, as usual, had gone into her room after dinner without exchanging many words with Margaret. The house was silent, and Margaret was in the kitchen finishing organizing some things when she heard a muffled sound coming from upstairs. Curious, she approached the hallway and suddenly realized it was Emily's voice. She was talking on the phone, but the tone of the conversation was unlike anything Margaret had heard before. Emily sounded worried. There was something strange about that conversation. Margaret hesitated for a moment. She wasn't the type to pry into other people's conversations, but something about the situation made her move carefully to the foot of the stairs. Emily's words became clearer as Margaret approached the ajar door. "No, Mark, we have to wait. I can't do anything until the wedding." "You know that," said Emily, her voice low and urgent. Margaret froze. Mark? Who was Mark? She kept listening, her heart beating fast in her chest. "Yes, he's already signed all the insurance documents. As soon as we're married, we can go ahead with the plan." Emily paused, apparently hearing the answer on the other end of the line. "I said I'll take care of it. Just give me a little more time." Margaret put her hand to her mouth, trying to suppress the shock coursing through her body. Plan? Safe? The gravity of the words began to form in her mind. Emily was talking about David. She was up to something terrible. Without thinking too much, Margaret looked around, searching for something that could help her. She saw her cell phone on the kitchen table. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone and activated the audio recorder. She didn't know if anyone would believe her, but she needed proof. Slowly, she moved closer to the door. "After the wedding, everything will be ours. He'll never suspect a thing." Emily laughed softly. "Of course I'll get rid of him, but only when the time is right. You just have to trust me." Margaret could hardly believe what she was hearing. The image that Emily had carefully constructed for David, the sweet and loving woman, was completely crumbling. Margaret felt betrayed, not just by Emily, but by the fact that her son was only a few steps away from falling into a deadly trap. She continued recording, keeping as still as possible. She wanted to run, she wanted to confront Emily right then and there, but she knew she had to be strategic. If she acted impulsively, she might never be able to protect David. Emily, on the other hand, seemed completely oblivious to the fact that she was being watched. Her voice remained cold and calculating. "Don't worry, Mark. No one will suspect a thing. As soon as he's out of the way, we'll disappear with the money and start our new life. It'll be perfect." Margaret felt a wave of nausea. That woman was planning to kill her son. The only reason Emily was with David was to benefit from the life insurance. It was cruel beyond anything Margaret could imagine. How could she have let something like that happen so close to her? The phone conversation continued for a few more minutes, but Margaret didn't need to hear anymore. She already had what she needed, proof that Emily was plotting against David. Now, the question was what to do with this information. She knew her son wouldn't believe her so easily. He was in love, enchanted by Emily. How could she break this illusion without completely destroying his trust? Margaret turned off the recording and carefully returned to the kitchen. Sitting at the table, she mentally went over what she had just heard. Her son was in imminent danger, and she was the only one who knew the truth. At that moment, Margaret realized that she had no time to lose. She had to be smarter and faster than Emily. Her mind began to draw up a plan. First, she had to make sure that David didn't marry that woman. But how? How could she convince everyone around her that Emily was a threat without sounding like an overprotective, paranoid mother? As the weight of responsibility fell on her shoulders, Margaret looked at her cell phone, still in her hand. The recordings were her only weapon. With it, she could confront Emily, expose her, and perhaps save David's life. But there was one question that bothered her deeply. What if Emily found out that Margaret knew about the plan? What would the consequences be? Margaret was sure that if Emily felt cornered, she would be even more dangerous. That sweet smile Emily wore as a mask could turn into something much darker. Margaret took a deep breath. There was no turning back. She knew too much now, and she had to protect her son at all costs. Margaret spent days dealing with the anguish of knowing what Emily was up to. Each morning, as she watched David leave for work, she felt a tightness in her chest. The nights were even worse. The silence in the house reminded her of every word she had heard in Emily's conversation with Mark. Margaret knew she had to act, but she was torn between fear and uncertainty. If she told David the truth, he might not believe her. After all, Emily had always seemed to be the perfect fiancée for him. Margaret also knew that her son was stubborn. David was in love and ready to start a life with Emily. But how could she keep quiet? The risk was too great. One day, sitting in her armchair, Margaret decided to try again. She needed to talk to someone. She needed advice. She called her older sister Carol, someone she could always count on. "Carol, I'm lost. I don't know what to do," Margaret said as soon as her sister answered the phone. "Margaret, what happened?" Carol asked worriedly, hearing the despair in her sister's voice. Margaret hesitated but began to tell her everything she had heard. Every detail of Emily's conversation with Mark, his diabolical plan, and how he recorded the exam without her knowing. On the other end of the line, Carol listened intently without interrupting. "Margaret, you have to tell David about this," Carol finally said, with a firmness that Margaret expected. "He needs to know the truth before it's too late." "I know, Carol, I know," Margaret replied, her voice breaking. "But he won't believe it. He's completely blinded by Emily. How am I going to convince my own son that the woman he loves is planning something so horrible?" Carol took a deep breath before speaking again. "Show him the proof. Show him the recording. There's no way he can ignore it." Margaret was silent for a few seconds, thinking about her sister's words. Carol was right, of course. The recordings were her only chance. But even so, Margaret worried about the devastating effect it would have on David. He trusted Emily blindly, and the revelation of her betrayal would be a very hard blow. "Maybe you're right, Carol," Margaret finally murmured. "But I don't want to destroy my son. It will destroy him." "And what will happen if you do nothing?" Carol retorted. "If this woman really goes through with her plan, Margaret, not only will you lose your son, but you'll also have to live with the weight of knowing that you could have stopped it. Don't let fear paralyze you." Margaret felt a lump in her throat. Carol was right. She couldn't let fear stop her from saving David's life. "I'm going to tell him," Margaret said with growing determination. "I just need to find the right moment. It can't be any old way. It has to be at the right time." She hung up the phone, feeling a little stronger after talking to her sister. But still, the dilemma remained. How and when to tell David the truth? And moreover, how to ensure that Emily didn't suspect anything until then? Margaret knew that Emily was clever. Any false move and she could see that she was being unmasked. The days passed, and Margaret continued to observe. She tried to act normally, without arousing suspicion, but Emily, on the other hand, seemed more restless. She was constantly on the phone, muttering things that Margaret couldn't hear clearly. She was clearly anxious as the wedding approached, which made Margaret even more certain that Emily's plan was in motion. One evening, while they were having dinner, Margaret decided to try once again to get close to David. "Son, you seem so happy about all this," she commented, trying to sound casual. "How are the wedding preparations going?" David smiled, his eyes shining with excitement. "Everything's going well, Mom. Emily is taking care of almost everything. She's amazing, you know. I was very lucky to find someone like her." Margaret smiled back, but felt a tightness in her chest. How could David be so blind? "Have you thought about reviewing the insurance contract you signed?" she asked, trying not to sound suspicious. "Sometimes these documents have clauses that we don't even realize." David frowned for a moment, but then shrugged. Mom, everything's under control. Emily is very organized. She's already taken care of everything. There's no need to worry." That answer made Margaret's heart race. The insurance contract. Emily had already prepared the ground for her plan. After dinner, Margaret went up to her room and picked up her cell phone again. The recordings were there, ready to be used. She knew she couldn't put it off any longer. She was racing against time, and every day that passed brought David closer to danger. Sitting on the bed, Margaret stared at the ceiling, trying to imagine what David's reaction would be when he heard the truth. He would be devastated, perhaps furious with her for having done this. But deep down, Margaret knew there was no other option. She had to be strong enough to endure the pain of seeing her son face this harsh reality. She had to be brave, not for herself, but for him. And it was there, in that moment of loneliness and worry, that Margaret made her final decision. She would act. The wedding day finally arrived. Margaret woke up with a heavy feeling in her chest, knowing that this would be a crucial day. The sun was shining outside, and everything seemed to be in perfect order for the ceremony. Inside, however, there was a storm of emotions. She knew what she needed to do, but the fear of how everything would turn out consumed her. David was radiant. He was getting dressed in the next room, adjusting his suit while chatting animatedly to a friend on the phone. Margaret could hear his laughter, full of anticipation and happiness. It broke her heart. He had no idea what he was about to discover. Margaret was sitting on the bed, holding her cell phone. Emily's recordings were there, ready to be used. She had decided to wait until the last moment to act, in the hope that something would change. Perhaps, on some level, she still wanted to believe that it was all a misunderstanding. But deep down, Margaret knew that wasn't the case. While she was lost in her thoughts, David appeared at the door. "Mom, how do I look?" he asked, smiling. Margaret looked at her son and her heart squeezed. He was so happy, so blinded by the illusion of love that Emily had created. "You look beautiful, my son," she replied, with a soft smile, trying to hide her concern. David came over and sat down next to her. "Thanks, Mom. I know you didn't like the idea of me getting married so quickly, but Emily is the right person. I'm sure of it." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. Sure. He was so confident, so oblivious to the danger he was in. "David, Margaret started to speak, but the words failed her. How could she destroy that moment for him? How could she reveal everything she knew when her son was so happy? Before she could continue, Emily entered the room. Dressed in an elegant wedding dress, she looked impeccable, with that smile she always wore in public. When she saw Margaret, her eyes lit up, but there was something else there. A hidden tension, as if she knew something was wrong. "Margaret, darling, can you give us a minute?" asked Emily, with a sweet but authoritative tone. Margaret looked at Emily and then at David, who was smiling distractedly. She knew that this was the last moment she could do anything, so she took a deep breath and nodded, standing up. "Of course, I'll go down and check on the preparations," said Margaret, remaining calm. As she left the room, her heart raced. The moment of truth was approaching. She needed to prepare herself, not only emotionally, but also with the evidence she had. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than an hour, and she knew that before then, she had to act. Margaret went downstairs and into the hall where the ceremony would take place. The guests were beginning to arrive, all looking so happy and carefree. She walked through the crowd, feeling disconnected from the festive atmosphere. Her eyes wandered around the venue, analyzing every detail, but her mind was focused on just one thing: saving David. She positioned herself next to the altar, her cell phone firmly in her hand. She could feel the sweat on her palms, but she tried to stay calm. The moment was coming. When David and Emily finally appeared in the hall, all eyes turned to them. Emily, stunning in her dress, walked with the confidence of someone who was about to conquer the world. David, by her side, looked like the happiest man in the universe. The justice of the peace was preparing to start the ceremony, and Margaret knew it was now or never. Before he could say the first word, she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "Wait!" shouted Margaret, with a firmness that surprised even herself. The guests fell silent, all turning to look at her. David stared at her in confusion, clearly not understanding what was going on. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. Margaret took a deep breath and looked directly at Emily, whose face still held a forced smile, but whose eyes revealed a growing nervousness. "David, I can't let this happen," said Margaret, her voice strong and determined. "You don't know the real Emily. She's not here for love. She's here to destroy you." The guests began to murmur, and David's gaze went from confusion to disbelief. "Mom, what are you talking about?" he asked, stepping forward, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Margaret held up the phone, her fingers trembling, but her determination unwavering. "I heard everything, David. I heard her plan. Emily is planning to kill you to take your life insurance money. And I have proof," said Margaret, looking into her son's eyes, hoping he would understand the gravity of what was happening. Emily tried to laugh, but her nervousness was visible. "This is ridiculous," said Emily, raising her voice. "Your mother is going mad, David. She's making all this up because she doesn't want to see me married to you." David looked at Emily, confused and shaken. He didn't know who to believe. "Mom, this can't be true," he said, shaking his head. Emily would never do something like that, but Margaret was already prepared. She pressed the play button on her cell phone, and the sound of Emily's voice echoed through the hall. The words Margaret had recorded were now on display for everyone to hear. "After the wedding, we'll get rid of him. The money will all be ours." The hall fell completely silent. Emily, unable to hide her true nature any longer, took a step back, her eyes full of fury. You don't understand," screamed Emily, despair beginning to take hold. "I had to do this. I had no other choice." David, stunned, stepped back, looking at Emily as if seeing her for the first time. "Emily, how could you?" he murmured, his voice weak, full of pain. Margaret said nothing. She had done what needed to be done. The hall fell completely silent, with all eyes fixed on Emily. She was paralyzed, unable to maintain her mask of sweetness. The recording continued to echo in the room, revealing every sordid detail of her plan. David, in shock, was still trying to process what he had just heard. His world, which until that moment had seemed perfect, was crumbling before his eyes. Margaret, standing next to him, watched her son's reaction. She knew it would be devastating, but there was no other choice. David needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it was. Emily, on the other hand, began to stir, her breathing quickening. Panic took over her face. The stunned crowd of guests were waiting for some kind of explanation, but everyone could see that there was no denying what had been revealed. This is a misunderstanding," Emily tried to stammer, her voice failing as her eyes desperately searched for support among those present. "Margaret is trying to ruin our marriage. She's always been against us. She's always hated me." David, still stunned, turned to his mother, as if he wanted an explanation for what was happening. "Mom, this can't be real," he said, his voice low, incredulous. Did you record it?" Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes full of compassion and sadness. "I did it because I needed to protect you, David. I heard Emily talking on the phone, planning everything. I tried to warn you before, but you weren't seeing what I was seeing. So I did what I had to do. For you." David looked at the floor, unable to find the words. The love he felt for Emily mixed with the betrayal he had just witnessed, creating a whirlwind of emotions. He wanted to believe that it was all a big mistake, but the evidence was there, incontrovertible. Emily, realizing that her deception had been exposed, changed her attitude. Her face contorted in anger, and the sweet tone she had always used disappeared. She stared at Margaret with pure hatred. "You've ruined everything," shouted Emily, now not bothering to keep up appearances. "You've destroyed my plan." David took a step back, shocked by Emily's sudden change. That was the real face of the woman he had planned to spend the rest of his life with. "Emily, how could you?" David murmured, the pain evident in his voice. "I trusted you. I loved you." Emily took a step forward, her fury growing. "You're an idiot, David, a blind idiot who never realized anything," she shouted, her voice filled with despair and anger. "Do you think I really cared about you? All I wanted was the money, and I would have gotten it if it hadn't been for that meddling old woman." Margaret remained calm, even in the face of Emily's outburst. She knew that this was the true face of the woman who had almost destroyed her son's life. "I won't let you hurt him," said Margaret, her voice firm, looking directly at Emily. "And now everyone knows who you really are." The tension in the hall was palpable. The guests murmured amongst themselves, shocked by what they were witnessing. The wedding, which was supposed to be a moment of joy, had turned into a spectacle of betrayal and deceit. Emily, realizing that there was no longer any escape, looked around, as if searching for a way out. Her expression changed from anger to fear. She knew the end had come, but she wasn't willing to be captured so easily. "You're not going to stop me?" shouted Emily, before trying to run towards the door. However, before she could take more than a few steps, two of the guests, who were off-duty police officers, quickly stood up and blocked her escape. They held her by the arms, immobilizing her as she struggled, screaming. "Let me go! Let me go!" she screamed in complete despair. David watched without saying a word. Shock still dominated his thoughts as his mind tried to process the cruel truth he had just discovered. The woman he loved, who he thought was his life partner, was ready to kill him for money. As Emily continued to fight off the policeman, one of the guests called the police. Within minutes, sirens could be heard in the distance. Emily, seeing that there was no escape, stopped resisting. Her shoulders slumped and she was let out, her eyes filled with impotent rage. Margaret watched with a heavy heart, but feeling relieved that she had prevented the worst. Her gaze turned to David, who was still motionless, staring into the void. She approached him slowly, lightly touching his arm. "David, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I wanted things to be different, but I couldn't let her hurt you." David finally looked at his mother, his eyes shining with tears that he was trying to hold back. He took a deep breath before speaking. I don't know what to say, Mom. I thought I knew you. I thought I'd found the love of my life." Margaret squeezed her son's hand, trying to convey comfort. "I know, my darling, I know it hurts. But you're safe now, and that's what matters." David nodded, even though the pain was still deep. He knew the healing process would be long, but at least his life was intact thanks to his mother's courage. Emily, cornered by the truth and immobilized by the police, was finally let out of the room, but the impact of what had happened was still reverberating around the room. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of sirens and the murmurs of the guests, who could hardly believe what they had witnessed. David stood still, watching as the woman he believed he loved was led away. His mind was still in shock. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet, and he was falling into a void of confusion and betrayal. Everything he had believed in, all the dreams he had built with Emily, had been destroyed in a matter of minutes. Margaret, by his side, felt a mixture of relief and sadness. She had done her duty as a mother, protecting her son from danger, but she knew that the emotional blow he had suffered would not be easy to overcome. "David," Margaret began, her voice soft, trying to reach her son's heart. "I know this is a lot for you to process, but I'm here by your side." David looked at her, his eyes watering. He tried to speak, but words failed him. The pain and disappointment were overwhelming. After a few seconds, he finally found his voice, but it was low, full of hurt. "I can't believe this was happening under my nose," he said, shaking his head slowly. "How come I didn't see anything, Mom? How could I have been so blind?" Margaret put her hand on his shoulder, offering the consolation she knew he needed. "You weren't blind, David. You were deceived. Emily was very good at hiding who she really was, but that's not your fault." David took a deep breath, trying to absorb his mother's words, but the weight of the betrayal was still too strong. "I was ready to spend the rest of my life with her, and she was just waiting for the right moment to destroy me," he said, his voice shaking. Margaret squeezed his shoulder a little harder, wanting him to know that he wasn't alone. "I know it hurts now, but you're alive. She didn't manage to do what she had planned, and that's the most important thing." David was silent, his thoughts wandering to what might have happened if his mother hadn't discovered the truth in time. He looked at Margaret with a new kind of gratitude, mixed with regret for not having listened to the signs earlier. "I should have listened to you, Mom. I should have realized something was wrong, but I was so focused on being happy, on believing that I had finally found love." Margaret shook her head, refusing to let him blame himself. "It's not your fault that you want to be happy, David. We all seek it, and you couldn't have known. No one could. I only knew because I saw what she was trying to hide from you. But that doesn't make you weak or naive. It makes you human." David lowered his head, absorbing her words. Try as he might, he still felt betrayed and vulnerable. Everything he believed in had been dismantled, piece by piece, in front of all his friends and family. "What do I do now?" he asked, almost in a whisper, as if asking for an answer that would ease the pain. Margaret sighed, understanding the depth of his despair. "Now you breathe one day at a time. It's going to be hard, but you'll get through it. It won't be quick or easy, but you have me and everyone who loves you by your side. And with time, you will heal. I promise." David nodded, but was still processing everything that had happened. He looked at the hall, still full of stunned guests, but their minds were elsewhere. He looked at the empty altar, where he should have sealed a life commitment, and felt a pang of bitterness. "It's as if it was all a lie," he said, more to himself than to his mother. "As if the love I felt meant nothing." Margaret came closer and hugged him, finally breaking the distance between them. "The love you felt was real, David. It was genuine from your side. It wasn't you who was wrong. It was her who deceived you. But that doesn't change who you are, nor does it diminish your capacity to love in the future." David closed his eyes, allowing his mother's words to envelop him. He knew that, despite all her support, that wound would still take a long time to heal. "I just don't know how to move on," he confessed, his voice still muffled with shock. "You'll figure it out in your own time," said Margaret, with the patience and wisdom of someone who had already faced many adversities in life. "And when you're ready, I'll be here, supporting you." David took a deep breath and for the first time that day, felt a small spark of strength return. He knew there was still a long way to go, but with his mother by his side, he wasn't alone. Minutes passed and finally the police returned to the hall to report that Emily had been taken into custody and would be formally charged. Mark, her accomplice, had also been captured and was on his way to the police station. The news brought a somber relief to the atmosphere, but the emotional damage had already been done. David looked at his mother one last time at that moment. "Thanks for saving me, Mom. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't acted." Margaret smiled with a mixture of pride and sadness. "I would do anything for you, David. You are my son, and I'll always be here to protect you, even when you don't know you need it." David nodded, feeling the weight of her words, and finally, with his eyes still full of tears, he accepted the hug she offered him. Emily was taken away by the police, and the hall, once full of anticipation for the ceremony, now looked desolate. The guests, still in shock, didn't know how to react. Some murmured amongst themselves, while others looked at David and Margaret with a mixture of compassion and discomfort. No one there had expected the day to end in such an emotional disaster. David remained still, staring into the void, trying to take in everything that had happened. He knew that the truth was out in the open, but that didn't make the pain any easier to bear. It was as if his whole world had collapsed in a matter of minutes, and he didn't know where to start rebuilding it. Margaret, by his side, remained silent, respecting the time David needed to process everything. She knew that he was facing one of the biggest betrayals of his life, and there were no words that could heal that immediately. All she could do was stand there, offering the silent support of a mother who, despite everything, had protected her son in the worst possible way. Suddenly, Emily started shouting from inside the police car, breaking the tense silence in the room. "It doesn't end here! You'll pay for this!" she shouted as the officers tried to restrain her. David and Margaret looked at each other, and the guests looked at each other, confused and shocked. Emily didn't look like the same person everyone knew. The mask she had been wearing had completely fallen away, revealing her true character. That outburst of anger, which used to be hidden behind a gentle smile, was now on display for all to see. "Let her scream, son," Margaret said softly, putting her hand on David's arm. "It just shows who she really is." David shook his head, still perplexed. "I can't believe she was planning all this," he muttered. "And now, seeing all this anger, it's like she's someone else." Margaret sighed, knowing that David was facing the pain not only of betrayal, but also of the collapse of an illusion he had created in his mind about who Emily was. "Emily was always like that, David," said Margaret, with the wisdom of someone who had seen people like that before. "She was just good at hiding that side. When someone is so obsessed with getting what they want, they'll do anything to keep up appearances. But eventually, the truth always comes out." David remained silent, absorbing his mother's words. He knew she was right, but it was still hard to accept that he had been so deceived. The memories of the moments he had spent with Emily, which had once been sweet and full of happiness, now seemed bitter and false. "How could I have missed this?" David asked, more to himself than to his mother. "How could I have been so blind?" Margaret squeezed his arm more firmly, trying to convey comfort. "Love can blind us, David. It's not your weakness. Emily knew what she was doing. She manipulated you, and it could have happened to anyone." David sighed deeply, knowing that his mother was trying to ease the guilt he felt. But it was still hard to shake the feeling that he had failed himself. "I trusted her," he said with a bitterness beginning to form in his voice. "I was ready to start a life with her, to build something real. And it was all just a lie." Margaret looked at him tenderly. "What you felt was real, David. What she did was manipulative, but your feelings were real. That shows the kind of person you are, someone who believes in love, who trusts. And that's not a bad thing. Don't let this experience take that away from you." David looked at his mother, trying to understand how someone could retain so much wisdom in the midst of chaos. He wanted to believe her, but at that moment the pain of betrayal was all he could feel. "I just don't know how to move on now," he said, his voice sounding more vulnerable than he would have liked. Margaret gave him a small, sad smile. "Moving on doesn't happen all at once, son. It's a process, and you don't have to figure it all out now. You just need to give yourself time. Allow yourself to feel the pain. Allow yourself to process what has happened. And above all, remember that you're not alone." David nodded slowly. He knew his mother was right, but still, the feeling of emptiness inside him was overwhelming. He started but stopped, not knowing how to continue. Margaret noticed and added, "You just need time, and that's what you'll get. Don't pressure yourself. The answers will come when you're ready." David looked up at the sky, taking a deep breath. He knew he still had a long way to go, but with his mother by his side, he felt a little stronger to start walking that path. The bond between them, which was already strong, now seemed even more unbreakable. "Thanks for being here, Mom," he said at last. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found out." Margaret smiled softly, her heart still heavy from the pain she knew David was carrying, but relieved to have saved him from the worst. "I'll always be here, David. Always." And so, hand in hand, they stood in silence, watching as the police car disappeared into the distance, taking David's past with Emily with it. The future was still uncertain, but at least at that moment, he knew he had his mother's strength by his side, and that was enough to start healing. In the days following the interrupted wedding, David and Margaret tried to deal with the emotional consequences of the revelation. The news about Emily and her dark plans spread quickly among friends and family, and Margaret's house was filled with visits from people worried about David. However, the presence of the others seemed to bring him more discomfort than relief. David, still in a state of shock, could barely talk. He was struggling with grief, trying to understand how someone he loved so much could have planned something so cruel. Margaret watched her son closely, but knew there was little she could do but be by his side. She offered him support, took care of his daily needs, but understood that emotional healing was something David would have to achieve on his own, in his own time. One quiet afternoon, while Margaret was preparing tea in the kitchen, David appeared silent, but with a more determined look than she had seen since their wedding day. "Mom, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice firmer, though still tinged with sadness. Margaret looked at him fondly, sensing that he was ready to discuss what was eating him up inside. "Of course, son. Sit here with me," she replied, pulling out a chair for him next to the table. David sat down, and for a few seconds, he was silent, as if he were choosing his words carefully. "I know you saved me from something horrible, and I'm eternally grateful for that. But there's something I need to ask you, something that's been bothering me ever since that day." Margaret nodded, encouraging him to continue. "How did you know it was the right time to do this?" he asked, his eyes searching his mother's. "How were you so sure that you had to expose everything in that way, on that day, at that moment? Wasn't it difficult?" Margaret looked at him for a moment, realizing the weight of that question. It was clear that David was still struggling, not only with Emily's betrayal, but with the very situation of having had his life exposed in such a public way. He wanted to understand what had been going on in his mother's mind. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done, David," she began, her voice full of sincerity. "I knew that revealing the truth like that could hurt you. I knew it would be a shock, and that what I was about to do would turn your world upside down. But I also knew that if I didn't do it, you'd be taking a much bigger risk." David looked down, absorbing her words, while Margaret continued. "I hesitated. I thought of other ways of dealing with it, other ways of talking to you in private. But I knew Emily was clever. If I tried to confront her first, she could make up a story, deny everything, turn you against me. And that could have made things worse. So I waited for the moment when she would have no way of escaping the truth." David was silent for a few seconds before finally speaking. "I still wonder if I would have believed you if you had told me before," he admitted, his voice laden with a mixture of guilt and regret. "I was so blind, Mom, so wrapped up in her. I didn't see what you saw, and even after everything, I still struggle to understand how I didn't. Margaret reached out and gently touched his hand. You couldn't have realized, David. She manipulated you, and manipulation is like that. Margaret's voice was firm but full of compassion. It's not your weakness. It's her ability to hide what she really was. People like that are very good at pretending. David took a deep breath, looking at the kitchen window, watching the wind that swayed the trees outside. The silence that followed between them was not uncomfortable, but full of reflection. I'm still angry, Mom, he confessed. Not just at her, but at myself, for having believed everything, for letting it go so far. I feel like a fool. Margaret squeezed his hand as if to give him all the strength she had. You're not a fool, David. You're human. And loving someone isn't weakness. It's courage. You trusted. You believed in love. And that will never be something to be ashamed of. It was her mistake, not yours. David nodded, trying to accept what his mother was saying, although he still felt a lump in his throat. I just want to get over it, he said softly, as if he were talking more to himself than to her. I want to put this pain behind me, but I don't know how. Margaret looked at her son, feeling the depth of the pain he carried. She knew that words of comfort could only go so far. True healing would come with time, patience, and the inner strength that David would need to find within himself. The pain will lessen with time, she said softly. You'll get through it day by day, and eventually you'll realize that this experience, cruel as it was, has made you stronger. But for now, what you need to do is allow yourself to feel. Don't try to bury this pain or pretend it isn't there. Feel it, process it, and then, little by little, it will lose its grip on you. David looked at his mother with an expression of gratitude. He knew it would be a long road, but knowing he had someone like her by his side made him feel less lost. Thank you, Mom, he said, his voice soft. Thank you for not giving up on me. Even when I was blind, even when I couldn't see what was happening, you were there, protecting me. Margaret smiled, feeling the warmth of that moment. She knew that, despite everything, the bond between her and David was stronger than ever. And although the future was still uncertain, they were going to face it together. I'll always be here, David, she said with a tone that mixed firmness and tenderness. No matter what happens, you'll never be alone. David nodded, his eyes watering. For the first time in days, he felt that, although there was still a long road to recovery ahead of him, he had the strength to keep going. And with his mother by his side, he knew he would get through it. As the days went by, David's wounds began to heal, albeit slowly. The shock and pain of having been betrayed by Emily were still there, but Margaret's constant presence and the support of close friends made all the difference. He had begun to resume his routine, trying to find some sense of normality amid the emotional chaos that had settled into his life. Margaret, for her part, watched every step of David's recovery with a squeezed heart, but relieved to see him getting stronger every day. She knew that there were still times when he isolated himself to process the pain, but she could also see that he was beginning to accept the situation and move on. One afternoon, while Margaret was preparing lunch, David came into the kitchen, looking a little livelier than he had done in weeks. He pulled up a chair and sat at the table watching his mother as she chopped the vegetables. Mom, I've been thinking, he began with a tone that immediately captured her attention. Margaret looked at him curiously, noticing a certain serenity in his voice that she hadn't heard for a long time. About what, my son? David took a deep breath before continuing. About everything that's happened, you know? About how things fell apart so quickly, and about what I learned from it. Margaret paused for a moment, letting the silence accommodate his words, before turning to face him directly. And what did you learn? She asked with a look of affection. David smiled slightly, a smile that was still shy but carried a sense of relief. He was rebuilding himself, little by little. I've learned that I can't let this experience define me. As hard as it was, I can't let it turn me into a bitter person, suspicious of everyone. I want to believe that I can still find something real, something worthwhile. Margaret felt a surge of pride and emotion when she heard this. She knew that David was beginning to heal, beginning to find his way back to himself. I'm glad to hear that, David, she said, approaching the table to sit down next to him. It shows the strength you have inside you. You didn't let this betrayal destroy your essence, David nodded, but there was still something else in his thoughts, something he needed to express. And I also realized, something else, Mom, he continued, his voice soft but full of sincerity. I realized that you were always my greatest protector, even when I was blind, even when I couldn't hear you. If it hadn't been for you, I wouldn't be here today. Margaret smiled, but tears were forming in her eyes. She knew that what she had done had been difficult, but hearing David's words confirmed that, despite all the pain, it had been worth it. I did what any mother would do, David, she replied, her voice slightly shaken. You are my son. Protecting you is what I do, what I will always do. David looked into his mother's eyes, realizing the depth of the love and dedication she had always had for him. The bond between the two of them, which was already strong, now seemed unbreakable. I know it was hard for you too, he said with a sincerity that touched Margaret's heart. You had to watch me suffer. You had to expose everything in front of everyone. But you did it for me, and I'll never forget it. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the tears slide down her face. She tried to cover it up with a smile, but she couldn't contain the emotion of that moment. I would do it all over again if I had to, she said firmly. Seeing you safe and alive, even though it was hard, is all that matters to me. David nodded, understanding the sacrifice his mother had made. He leaned forward and hugged her, a silent hug, but full of gratitude and love. During that hug, he realized that, as much as life had played a bitter trick on him, he had something that was worth much more: his mother's presence and unwavering love. After a few minutes, David pulled away, smiling at her. I think I can start rebuilding my life now, he said with a new sparkle in his eyes. It won't be easy, but with you by my side, I feel I can face anything. Margaret smiled back, feeling the same pride she had always had for him, but now with an extra touch of admiration for the strength David was showing. And you can, David. You're much stronger than you think. And what happened just showed that to the world, she said. David got up and started helping his mother with lunch, something he used to do when he was younger. That small gesture of normality made Margaret smile even more, seeing that little by little, the old David was coming back. Over the next few days, they began to get back to life, one step at a time. David, although still scarred by the experience, was more optimistic, more confident that his future could be better. And Margaret, always by his side, felt at peace with having done what was necessary, knowing that she had fulfilled her role as a mother. Their bond had grown stronger, and the traumatic experience that could have destroyed David had actually made him more resilient. He knew that the road to recovery was still long, but with his mother by his side, he was prepared for any challenge. The strength they found in each other was what would keep them going, and together they were ready to face whatever life brought next. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more stories like this one, we have prepared the next video just for you. Click here to watch.